in Michigan, Donald Trump's head-to-head matchup with Joe Biden shows that Joe Biden is now well ahead of him in double digits in Michigan. And, Jake, we're hearing, and I'm not exactly sure why, maybe you can explain to us, Biden had 55 to 39% in Michigan. The Detroit Free Press said that perhaps some of the movement, the net 4 movement in Biden's direction was because of what happened on June the 1st. People seem to be repulsed by that. But why is Biden doing so well in all of the swing states, or in most of the swing states right now? Because you look at polls, and it used to be that the swing states were really tight and close, even if Biden were up by 8 or 9 points nationally. But now we're seeing more and more polls that are saying Biden not only has a double-digit lead, but he's also doing very well in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, Pennsylvania, and things are even getting tight. Biden's even ahead in some polls in swing states like Ohio and Iowa. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, you could choose any number of the reasons. I mean, the president seems to inject himself into controversies without much logic or reason behind it. And I agree. This is not just Michigan, as you just noted. It's Ohio. It's Iowa, where the vice president visited yesterday. In a Des Moines Register poll, it showed a tight race, a state that the president has been relatively popular in, which also has a tight Senate race. You're seeing this in Arizona, too. And if you look kind of across the map, again, these are polls 139 days before the election. But if you look across the map, if you start putting states like Arizona, Iowa in play, Michigan in play, then that shuts off a huge pathway for the president for re-election. And it calls into question why he's not doing things that are broadly popular with the base. And I'm not the president's political strategist, and I've tried to understand for years why he has not done things that are clearly quite popular with the broad brush of the American public. But he continues to do things like inject himself into controversies, the military patrolling the streets, not getting rid of Confederate named bases. I mean, these are things that even on Capitol Hill, with some of the most conservative members of Congress and members of the Senate, these are things that are no-brainers for people who are practiced politicians that the president just doesn't really have the appetite to get his arms around.
So, Michael Steele, you look at those numbers. I think most people in Michigan think that's a bigger spread than obviously we'll see, 16 points. But in this moment in time, the president is struggling in the places where he won by just a hair. You can add Michigan into that conversation. You can add Wisconsin into that conversation. And also places now where he's having to play defense, places like Texas and Georgia and Arizona and other places where he's going to have to spend time and money to lock down states he's already won, forget about winning new states. It's not a big mystery about why we are where we are. It's his handling of this moment, this racial justice moment, but also his handling for the last 4 months of the pandemic as people see what's actually happening in their communities, in their hospitals, in their schools, in their workplaces. This thing is real. And as we've been talking about this morning, the president is trying to turn the page on something that very much remains on this page for the country.
You're exactly right, Willie. And the only reprieve for the president from these numbers is the fact that it's June. So, we are outside of that space where it becomes critical, which, of course, is Labor Day, which changes the entire dynamic of any campaign, especially a presidential campaign. You still have conventions to go through. You still have folks sort of checking out for the summer and all of that. So that gives the president some space to begin to reorient his ship of state, if you will, regarding his campaign. But to the point that Jake just made, the reality of it is that's not what Donald Trump has been known to do. He plays to the lowest common denominator. He plays to his base because he feels that as long as he has that, if he's got those white men over 50 locked in, and the more they're locked in, the stronger he feels he is, the better off he'll be longer term. The problem there is he's got this trifecta that's hit him upside the head like a brick. COVID-19, downturn in the economy, and now racial tension across the country. On each of those three fronts, he is losing ground with the very people he considers his base. He likes to tout just recently in a tweet, 96% of Republicans support me. No, they don't. The number's actually 84%. He's losing among independents. He's losing some of that base. And so what his campaign has been trying to do is to get him to reorient to that truth. And then that's, again, why they're doing the rallies this weekend, to get that momentum headed in the right direction for the president. But this is going to be a slog for him because of how Trump has approached those three big issues so far.
So, Jonathan Lemire, we're going to continue to pretend that this White House may work like a regular White House when it comes to facing re-election. I'll ask the question. Obviously, they do not. But again, it just defies logic. Every day, the president's numbers continue to go down. And I'm just wondering if when he had brief spasms of lucidity at the end of the 2016 campaign and went quiet, I'm wondering if there's a response coming from the Trump White House on polling numbers, 39% at Gallup and 39% in other polls. I think Morning Consult this morning is 40%. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jake. He's down 16 percentage points in Michigan. The Trump White House was planning to have 15 to 20% of black voters on their side in 2020, which would be certainly a record since I would guess 1960 with Nixon, when he had 33% of black voters. But he's losing black voters left and right. He's losing working class white women in the industrial Midwest overwhelmingly. He's losing independents overwhelmingly. Of course, he's already lost suburban women. He's losing women by record numbers. So that is a reality facing Donald Trump. That is a reality facing his campaign. And I will ask the question again that I ask all the time. What are they going to do to stem the tide? Do they pretend that they have a plan to stop just drilling down on this base that is now down to 39% and getting to the 46, 47, 48% that they need to be reelected?
You're right, Joe, in remembering that the only time we've seen the president be really disciplined and stay on message, or in that case, quiet, was that last week or so of the 2016 campaign. There have been people around him who have urged a similar tactic now. But we just have to look at yesterday's event in the Rose Garden to see that that's not working. The president stayed on script for a little while, talked about the executive order, extolled some of the good things that were in it, and then immediately abandoned his notes and started doing his usual attacks on the media and Democrats and making claims about how much he had done for African American voters that just don't stand up. The president, they know, the people around him, his inner circle, there's concern. They know that they're down. And we've talked about the show quite a bit about how Michigan they feel like is almost out of reach, and this new poll sort of emphasizes that. But there are a number of other places where there are red alerts going off, alarm bells are sounding. Places like Iowa and Ohio, Georgia and Texas, where, yes, I think they still feel confident they will win, but they're suddenly now concerned they're going to have to devote a lot of time, energy, and resources to hang on to states that a few months ago they thought were safely in their column. And reflexively, the president only really has a few moves here, Joe. He's never shown the ability to grow his base of support, to reach out to new voters. He just doubles down, again, on that bedrock core supporters who, as you note, may be shrinking, finally. There have not been many controversies that have really stuck to this president. We wrote this morning in the Associated Press. There's just most of them. He has an uncanny ability to shake off these bad headlines. A few have. Charlottesville, Helsinki, images of the children at the cages of the Mexican border. But Lafayette Square and his handling of that, using federal law enforcement to clear peaceful protesters, is really resonating. And the campaign is tracking worrisome polling that shows that has cost him support among some Republicans, among some independents. And right now, the only answer this campaign has is to try to lean into the economy, suggesting that if the economy bounces back, it's a rising tide that will lift all boats. That's what they're betting on. But as we see, if the pandemic comes back, and we're already seeing signs that it's not going away, that'll damage the economy too.
Absolutely.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.